The galaxy's most feared bounty hunter carried a secret buried deeper than Beskar could hide. Boba Fett had built his legend on cold precision and Mandalorian steel, never knowing that something ancient slept beneath his skin, waiting for the right moment to awaken. When a storm on Tatooine dragged him into a forgotten cavern, visions tore through his mind like lightning, revealing a truth that shattered everything he believed about himself. The Force had always been there, dormant in his blood, guiding shots that should have missed and saving him from deaths that should have claimed him. But power without training is a beacon in the dark, and Darth Vader can sense even the faintest light trying to hide in shadow. Could the hunter who served no master learn to wield the galaxy's greatest weapon, or would his gift become the chain that finally bound him? The twin suns of Tatooine burned with their ancient, merciless light, casting long shadows across the dune sea where empires rose and fell like grains of sand caught in the endless wind. This was a world that remembered nothing, forgave nothing, and offered sanctuary only to those willing to become as hard and unforgiving as the desert itself. In the years following the Clone Wars, when the Republic had collapsed into the iron fist of the Galactic Empire, Tatooine remained what it had always been, a haven for the desperate, the forgotten, and those who hunted them for profit. The Hutts still ruled their criminal networks from perfumed palaces. Moisture farmers still coaxed life from air too dry to breathe, and bounty hunters still arrived under cover of stellar winds, their ships descending like carrion birds to claim whatever price the galaxy had placed on flesh and blood. Boba Fett had returned to Tatooine not out of sentiment but necessity. His target was a former Imperial logistics officer named Thane Corvus, a man who had stolen encrypted data cores containing fleet deployment schedules and safe house locations across the Outer Rim. The Empire wanted him alive for interrogation. The bounty was substantial enough to justify 3 weeks of tracking across hyperspace lanes and backwater stations, following a trail of false identities and abandoned safe houses until it led here, to this wasteland of dust and broken dreams. Fett had landed Slave 1 in a canyon 20 kilometers from Mos Eisley, concealing the ship beneath camouflage netting that shimmered with adaptive pigmentation. He had checked his weapons with the methodical precision that defined every moment of his existence. EE-3 carbine rifle fully charged, wrist-mounted fiber-cord whip coiled and tested, knee-pad rocket dart launcher, armed with a paralytic toxin calibrated for human physiology. Everything had been perfect. Everything had been controlled, until the sandstorm came. It rose from the southern wastes without warning, a wall of ochre fury that swallowed the horizon and turned day into screaming twilight. Fett had encountered desert storms before on a dozen worlds, knew the protocols for survival, but this storm carried something else within its howling chaos. Static discharge crackled through his helmet's sensors, fragmenting his tactical display into meaningless noise. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. Sand scoured his armor with a sound like grinding teeth, and the wind pressed against him with force enough to drive him backward, step by step, until his boots found only empty air. The canyon edge crumbled beneath him. He fell. 20 meters of vertical descent through churning sand and broken rock, his jetpack failing to ignite as electromagnetic interference disrupted its ignition sequence. He struck an outcropping that shattered under impact, tumbled through darkness punctuated by flashes of rust-colored light, and finally crashed into a cavern floor that had not felt the touch of living things in centuries. His armor absorbed most of the kinetic energy, distributing force across reinforced plating, but something in his left side cracked with a wet snap that sent white fire through his ribs. His helmet's internal diagnostic systems flickered, failed, rebooted into emergency mode that painted his vision in shades of amber threat analysis. The storm raged above. Silence pressed down below. Fett lay still for 30 seconds, assessing damage through the clinical detachment that had kept him alive through 100 ambushes and twice as many close calls. 3 ribs fractured, minor concussion probability at 47%, right shoulder joint strained but functional, left gauntlet's weapon systems offline, communications array damaged beyond field repair. The cavern around him stretched away into darkness that his helmet's low-light amplification struggled to penetrate, revealing only fragments of ancient stone and something else, something that made his threat assessment subroutines flash warning colors he had never seen before. There were carvings on the walls, symbols that predated the Republic, perhaps predated civilization itself. They pulsed with faint luminescence, blue-white light that seemed to breathe in rhythm with something Fett could not identify. He pushed himself upright despite the protest of broken bone, his breath coming shallow and controlled behind his helmet's filtration systems. The cavern was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow, its floor smooth as glass and covered in a thin layer of dust that showed no footprints but his own. The carvings formed intricate spirals and geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than his eyes were equipped to process. And in the center of the chamber stood a structure, an altar, perhaps, or a meditation chamber built by hands long turned to dust. It was a circular platform raised 3 steps above the cavern floor, constructed from stone that gleamed like frozen starlight. Upon its surface rested a single object, a crystal the size of a human fist, multifaceted and perfect, containing within its structure a light that shifted between colors he could name and colors that existed only in dreams. The crystal sang. That was the only word for it, a sound that bypassed his helmet's audio filters and resonated directly in his skull, in his chest, in the hollow spaces where he had learned to bury everything soft enough to be used against him. It was not language, it was not music, it was something older than both, a frequency that seemed to harmonize with the electrical impulses of his own nervous system. Fett's hand moved toward his blaster without conscious thought. The crystal flared brighter. Pain exploded behind his eyes. Not physical pain, though his body registered it as such, but something deeper and more fundamental, as if every synapse in his brain had suddenly fired in unison. His vision whited out. His hearing collapsed into a single sustained tone. And then the visions came. He saw Camino through eyes too young to understand what they witnessed, rain hammering against transparasteel viewports, while scientists in white coats discussed genetic variants and behavioral conditioning. He saw his father's face, Jango Fett's scarred features set in an expression that might have been pride or might have been assessment, teaching him to field strip a blaster before he had learned to read. He saw the arena on Geonosis, dust and blood, and the moment when Mace Windu's violet blade separated a head from shoulders, creating an orphan in the span of a single lightsaber swing. But there was something else beneath the memories, a current that ran deeper than recollection, a sense of connection to something vast and incomprehensible that threaded through every moment of his life like invisible wire. He remembered the time on Ord Mantell when he had known, absolutely known, that the Rhodian smuggler would break right instead of left 3 seconds before the target moved. He remembered the impossible shot on Nar Shaddaa, his blaster bolt curving around a pillar at an angle that violated basic physics to strike a fleeing Quarren in the shoulder. He remembered 100 other moments where instinct had become prescience, where reaction time had compressed into something that felt less like training and more like certainty written into the fabric of reality itself. He had always attributed it to his father's genetics, superior reflexes bred into clone template DNA, Kaminoan engineering that made him sharper, faster, better than baseline humans. But the visions showed him truth laid bare like exposed nerve endings. The Force had always been there, dormant, suppressed beneath layers of discipline and denial, waiting. The realization hit him with the impact of a thermal detonator. Fett staggered backward off the platform, his boots scraping against stone as he fought to separate present reality from the cascade of images still flooding his consciousness. He saw Jedi falling by the thousands, their lights extinguished across the galaxy in a single coordinated purge. He saw Sith Lords wreathed in crimson lightning, their faces twisted into masks of hunger and domination. He saw the space between light and shadow, the place where power existed without allegiance, where the Force itself flowed like water seeking its own level, and he saw his own face reflected in the crystal's depths, changed, augmented, dangerous in ways that transcended any weapon he had ever carried. The vision shattered. He was back in the cavern, on his knees, the crystal's light fading to a dull pulse that matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat. His ribs still ached, His damaged armor still registered a dozen system failures, but something had shifted in the fundamental architecture of his perception. He could feel the air moving against his skin, even through his bodysuit's environmental seal. He could sense the weight of stone above him, the vast emptiness of the desert beyond, the distant presence of life forms scattered across Tatooine's surface like stars in a particularly sparse constellation. The Force. He was feeling the Force. The thought filled him with something that might have been rage or might have been terror. Fett had built his entire identity on a foundation of certainty. He was a tool, honed to perfection, the galaxy's most effective instrument of capture and death. His reputation rested on skill, discipline, and the legacy of Jango Fett's genetic superiority. He was not a Force user. He was not a Jedi. He was certainly not one of those mystic fools who believed the universe cared about their choices or granted them supernatural powers based on moral alignment. He was a bounty hunter, nothing more, nothing less. Except now that certainty had cracked like faulty armor plate, and through the cracks, something vast and terrible was pouring in. Fett forced himself upright, his body moving through pain that his newly sensitized nervous system registered with startling clarity. He needed to leave this place. He needed to complete his contract. He needed to find Thane Corvus, collect his bounty, and return to the simple, brutal mathematics of survival that had governed his entire existence. The crystal still pulsed on its platform, calling to him with harmonics that promised understanding, mastery, transformation into something more than what he had been. He turned his back on it. The climb out of the cavern took 3 hours, his ascent aided by fiber cord and pure, stubborn refusal to acknowledge the possibility of failure. The sandstorm had passed, leaving the desert scoured clean beneath a sky full of stars that seemed somehow closer than they had been before. He reached Slave 1 as the first sun began to rise, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rust. His ship's systems ran diagnostic checks that confirmed what he already knew. Communications were down, several sensor arrays needed replacement, but the hyperdrive and weapons remained operational. Good enough. He pulled up the tracking data on Thane Corvus, reviewing the last confirmed sighting that had led him to Tatooine in the first place. The target had been spotted entering Mos Eisley's eastern district, an area notorious for spice dens and illegal tech markets. Fett had planned to wait for the target to emerge, isolate him in the desert, and execute a clean capture far from witnesses or complications. That plan still held, except now he could feel Corvus. Not precisely, not with the clarity of a homing beacon, but as a presence in the Force that registered as a knot of anxiety and desperate calculation approximately 8 kilometers to the northwest. The sensation made his skin crawl. He had not asked for this awareness, he did not want it, but denying its existence seemed as futile as denying gravity or the vacuum of space. Fett secured his helmet, checked his weapons one final time, and began the walk toward Mos Eisley. The city rose from the sand like a collection of tumors, domed structures, and angular towers connected by narrow streets that channeled wind and shadow in equal measure. Fett entered through a service entrance used by moisture farmers bringing their harvest to market, his armor drawing looks from sentients who knew better than to ask questions of a man carrying that much firepower. He moved through the crowds with the economical precision that had become second nature, his newly awakened senses feeding him information faster than his conscious mind could process. He could feel fear radiating from a Twi'lek arguing with a Toydarian merchant. He could sense the predatory focus of 3 Aqualish thugs tracking a human teenager through the marketplace. He could detect the hollow resignation of a protocol droid whose memory had been wiped 17 times. The Force showed him everything and demanded nothing, a constant stream of data that threatened to overwhelm his carefully constructed mental filters. Fett pushed it down, walled it off behind the same discipline that allowed him to function in firefights and zero-gravity environments. He was hunting. Everything else was irrelevant. He found Thane Corvus in a cantina called the Dusty Bantha, an establishment that catered to spacers who preferred their drinks strong and their conversations private. The target sat in a back corner booth, his fingers drumming against a datapad, while his eyes tracked every entrance and exit with the paranoid attention of a man who knew he was hunted. Fett observed from across the street, his helmet's damaged sensors supplemented now by something far more reliable. He could feel Corvus's pulse, the rapid thump of a heart working overtime, the chemical signature of stimulants racing through the target's bloodstream, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he could reach his contact and disappear before the Empire's reach closed around his throat. Fett calculated firing solutions, approach vectors, extraction routes. He could enter through the front door, stun Corvus with a wrist rocket before anyone realized what was happening, and drag the unconscious body out through the service alley. Clean, efficient, professional. His hand moved toward his holstered blaster, and then he felt something else. A presence in the Force that made his newly awakened senses scream warning. Cold, vast, utterly remorseless. It was approaching from the south, moving through the city with the inevitability of a star collapsing into a black hole. Fett's tactical training identified the threat before his conscious mind caught up. Imperial presence, heavy concentration, multiple units converging on this exact location. But this was not a standard garrison patrol. The darkness he felt carried a weight that transcended normal military operations. Vader, the name appeared in his mind, like a transmission from some part of himself that understood what his conscious awareness refused to acknowledge. Darth Vader was on Tatooine, and he was hunting the same target. Fett's contract suddenly became vastly more complicated. He had two options: abort the mission and lose the bounty, or execute the capture immediately and risk confrontation with the Empire's most terrifying enforcer. The decision matrix was simple. Fett had not survived this long by backing down from complications. He moved. The cantina's front entrance exploded inward as he breached through the door with explosive charges that cleared a path through startled patrons and overturned furniture. His EE-3 carbine came up in a smooth arc, its targeting laser painting Corvus's chest with a red dot that promised finality. But the target was already moving, his enhanced reflexes suggesting military augmentation or combat stims. Blaster fire erupted from a concealed holdout pistol, bolts that would have caught a slower hunter-center mass. Fett moved before the trigger pull, his body sliding left in a motion that his training could not entirely explain. The Force had whispered, warning a fraction of a second before conscious thought, granting him the temporal advantage that separated the living from the dead. He returned fire with 3 precisely placed shots that shattered Corvus's weapon and sent the target sprawling backward into the booth. "Contract says alive," Fett said, his voice emerging from his helmet's vocabulator as something mechanical and final. "Try to die and I collect half." Corvus raised his hands, blood streaming from a laceration across his palm where the destroyed blaster had torn flesh. "You don't understand what you're caught in the middle of. That data I took?" It details. Fett's fiber cord whip lashed out, wrapping around the target's torso and contracting with enough force to drive the air from Corvus's lungs. He dragged the man forward, already moving toward the service exit, his enhanced awareness tracking the approaching Imperial presence that was now less than 3 minutes away. Too close, too fast. He burst into the alley behind the cantina, Corvus struggling weakly against his restraints, and activated his jetpack with a burst of propellant that sent them both skyward. The city fell away beneath him in a blur of sandstone and shadow. His helmet's navigation systems plotted a course back to Slave 1, calculating fuel consumption and optimal trajectory. And then the Force screamed, danger from below, rising with impossible speed. Fett twisted in mid-flight, his sensors finally catching what his new awareness had already detected: a black-clad figure ascending on repulsor boots, cape streaming behind him like the wings of some predatory bird, one hand extended forward as if reaching across the space between them. Darth Vader, his mask a death's head rendered in obsidian and crimson, his presence in the Force, a void that seemed to swallow light itself. "Release the prisoner," Vader's voice carried across the distance, amplified by his armor's external speakers. "The Empire has prior claim." Fett's response was to gun his jetpack's thrusters to maximum, sacrificing fuel efficiency for raw speed. Corvus screamed as acceleration pressed him backward. Mos Eisley blurred into abstraction, but Vader was faster, his Force-assisted propulsion carrying him forward with supernatural grace. The Sith Lord raised his hand. Fett felt pressure close around his throat, like an invisible gauntlet. The Force choke was legendary among those who survived encounters with Vader, a technique that crushed windpipes and vertebrae with equal ease. But Fett's newly awakened connection to the Force provided something he had never possessed before. A sense of the energy patterns flowing toward him, the invisible fingers of telekinetic power reaching across space to claim his life. He did not know how to counter it. He had no training, no understanding of the metaphysics involved, but he knew how to survive. His mind, shaped by decades of combat adaptation, reached out instinctively and found resistance. Not a wall, not a barrier, but something more fundamental, the simple refusal to die. The Force responded to that determination with a surge of energy that disrupted Vader's technique for a fraction of a second. Not enough to break it completely, but enough to give Fett the opening he needed. His wrist rocket launcher coughed a projectile that streaked toward Vader, trailing white smoke. The Sith Lord's lightsaber ignited, its crimson blade appearing like a wound in reality, and bisected the rocket in a motion almost too fast to track. The explosion bloomed between them, a sphere of fire and shrapnel that would have shredded a normal human. Vader emerged from the flames untouched, but Fett had already changed vectors, his jetpack's maneuvering thrusters firing in a pattern that sent him into a spiraling descent toward the desert floor. He released Corvus from the fiber cord at 3 meters altitude, letting the target hit sand hard enough to stun but not kill, then executed a ground-level sprint that pushed his armor's servo motors to their mechanical limits. Behind him, Vader descended like judgment itself. Fett's newly sensitized awareness showed him the Sith Lord's intention before it manifested in physical action. Vader was not pursuing for the bounty. The Empire already had the target. No, this chase had become something else, something that made the darkness around Vader pulse with an emotion that might have been curiosity or might have been hunger. The Dark Lord had felt what Fett had done. He had sensed the untrained Force resistance, and now he wanted to understand what manner of creature could possess such a gift yet remain outside the Jedi purges and Sith hierarchies. Fett ran. He crossed the sand in leaping strides that his enhanced reflexes measured and optimized with every step. His jetpack coughed dry, its fuel exhausted, and fell away in pieces that his quick-release mechanism ejected before the weight could slow him down. The canyon where Slave One waited appeared ahead, its familiar contours offering sanctuary if he could just reach it before. The sand beneath his feet erupted. Telekinetic force lifted him bodily and slammed him into a rock formation hard enough to crack stone and dent armor plating. His helmet's heads-up display flickered into static. His medical readouts screamed warnings about internal trauma and systemic shock. Through the interference and pain, he saw Vader approaching at a measured pace, his lightsaber held in a guard position that spoke of absolute confidence. "You possess a gift," Vader said, his respirator punctuating each word with mechanical rhythm. Raw, untrained, yet potent enough to register across the Force like a beacon. "Tell me how a clone template's genetic duplicate came to possess Force sensitivity." Fett pushed himself upright, despite his body's protest. Blood filled his mouth, copper-tasting and warm. "Not your business, Sith. Everything in this galaxy is my business." Vader gestured, and Fett's blaster tore itself from his holster, flying across the space between them to land in the Sith Lord's grasp. "The Emperor will be most interested in this development." A Force-sensitive clone, descended from Jango Fett's line. The implications for future clone programs are significant. Understanding hit Fett like a second impact. He was not a person to Vader. He was a resource, a data point in the Empire's endless calculations of power and control. The rage that flooded through him carried heat enough to burn away every other consideration. He had spent his entire life avoiding the Jedi, the Sith, the endless religious war between light and dark that had destroyed the Republic and birthed the Empire. He had remained neutral, professional, a tool available to the highest bidder. And now, this black-armored monster wanted to reduce him to a specimen for study, to strip away his autonomy and turn his newly discovered gift into just another weapon in the Imperial arsenal. The Force responded to his fury. Energy surged through his limbs with wild, uncontrolled intensity. He moved faster than thought, faster than Vader could track, his fist driving toward the Sith Lord's mask with strength that exceeded the capabilities of his armor's servomotors. The blow connected. Vader's head snapped back, and the galaxy held its breath. The Sith Lord recovered instantly, his lightsaber coming up in a counterstrike that would have bisected Fett from shoulder to hip. But the bounty hunter's newfound awareness showed him the blade's path before it began, and he rolled beneath the killing arc with a precision that was part training and part prescience. His hand found a thermal detonator on his belt, primed it, and hurled it toward Vader's center mass. The explosion was immense. Sand and rock vaporized into a cloud of superheated plasma that painted the desert in shades of orange and white. Fett did not wait to observe the results. He sprinted for the canyon, his damaged armor protesting with every step, his force-enhanced senses screaming that the attack had bought him seconds at most. Behind him, through the dust and dissipating thermal bloom, he felt Vader's presence unchanged, unmarred, impossibly patient. The Sith Lord was not trying to kill him, he was testing, measuring, cataloging capabilities for future exploitation. Fett reached Slave 1 and triggered the boarding ramp with a thought that his ship's neural interface caught and interpreted. The vessel hummed to life around him, its engines cycling through ignition sequences that seemed to take eternities. Through the viewport, he saw Vader emerge from the smoke, his armor scorched but intact, his lightsaber extinguished now as if the weapon were no longer necessary. "You cannot run forever." The Sith Lord's voice reached him through external pickups, resonating with the certainty of prophecy. "The Force connects all things. You are bound to it now, and through it, you are bound to me." "Slave." I lifted off with thrusters that superheated the sand beneath them into glass. Fett angled toward the upper atmosphere, his fingers moving across controls with the automatic precision of someone who had flown this ship through 1,000 combat scenarios. But as Tatooine fell away beneath him and the stars became visible overhead, he could still feel Vader's presence like a weight pressing against the back of his skull. The Sith Lord had marked him, and the Empire had very long arms. Fett engaged the hyperdrive without filing a flight plan or checking for gravitational anomalies. The stars stretched into lines, the universe contracted into the familiar blue-white tunnel of hyperspace, and in the silence of faster-than-light transit, he finally allowed himself to confront what had happened. He was force-sensitive. The thought carried implications that threatened to unravel everything he had built. His reputation rested on skill and Fett legacy. If word spread that his success stemmed from supernatural ability rather than training and genetics, clients would question every capture, every kill. Rival hunters would see him as competition to be eliminated rather than a professional to be respected. And worst of all, Force users on both sides of the galaxy's eternal conflict would view him as a resource to be claimed or a threat to be destroyed. He needed answers. He needed to understand what had awakened inside him and how to control it before it controlled him. And there was only one person in the galaxy who might provide those answers without immediately trying to recruit, kill, or experiment on him: Quinlan Vos. The name surfaced from intelligence files Fett had compiled on surviving Jedi, targets that commanded premium bounties from the Empire. Vos was different from most survivors. He had operated in the underworld even before Order 66, walking the line between light and dark, using questionable methods for ostensibly noble ends. After the Purge, he had disappeared into the galactic fringe, rumored to be hiding among smugglers and pirates, trading his skills for information and survival. Fett had tracked Vos 3 years ago to the Wheel, a massive space station orbiting a barren world in the mid-rim. The Jedi had been working as an enforcer for a Hutt crime family, using mind tricks and precognitive awareness to collect debts and intimidate rivals. Fett had observed him for 2 days, compiling a tactical profile in case the Empire ever offered enough credits to justify the risk of engaging a trained Force user. He had not reported Vos's location. At the time, he had attributed his silence to simple practicality. The bounty was not worth the expenditure of resources required for capture. But now, Feeling the force move through him like an electrical current seeking ground, he wondered if something deeper had stayed his hand. Recognition, perhaps. A sense that Voss represented a path that existed outside the binary choice between Jedi martyrdom and Sith domination. Fett set course for the wheel. The journey through hyperspace took 4 days, which he spent in Slave the Muss' cramped cockpit, analyzing everything that had happened on Tatooine. The cavern, the crystal, the visions that had torn open his perception and revealed the force flowing beneath the surface of reality. And Vader. The encounter played through his mind on constant repeat, his tactical consciousness dissecting every moment, every choice, searching for weaknesses to exploit if their paths crossed again. Because they would cross again. He was certain of it with the same prescient awareness that had saved his life 100 times. The wheel materialized from hyperspace ahead of him, a massive ring of metal and light spinning on its axis, its surface covered with docking bays, gambling houses, pleasure dens, and fighting arenas. This was neutral ground, theoretically, a place where imperial authority held less weight than credits and reputation. Fett transmitted his docking codes, paid the exorbitant fees that came with maintaining a ship in high-traffic orbit, and descended into the station's labyrinthine interior. Finding Voss took 6 hours of careful questioning and strategic bribery. The Jedi was apparently working as a fight coordinator in the arena district, using his precognitive abilities to stage matches that appeared spontaneous but were actually carefully choreographed to maximize gambling profits. It was exactly the kind of morally dubious operation that fit Voss's profile. Fett found him in a maintenance tunnel beneath the main arena, discussing odds with a Rodian bookmaker. The Wookiee goes down in the 3rd round, Voss was saying, his hands gesturing in quick, animated movements. But make it look close. The crowd wants drama, and we need. He stopped mid-sentence, his head snapping around to fix on Fett's location despite the bounty hunter's stealth approach. Well, this is unexpected. Fett stepped into the light, his blaster drawn but not aimed. Quinlan Voss, Boba Fett. The Jedi's expression shifted through surprise, calculation, and something that might have been resigned amusement. I assume this isn't a social call. How much is the Empire paying for me these days? Not here for a bounty. Voss's eyebrows rose. That might be the most surprising thing I've heard all year. He dismissed the Rodian with a gesture, waiting until the bookmaker had scurried away before giving Fett his full attention. So what brings the galaxy's most notorious hunter to my doorstep if not a contract? Fett lowered his blaster. The Force. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Voss clearly understood. The Jedi's expression shifted into something more serious, his eyes narrowing as he reached out with senses that Fett could now feel like fingers brushing against his consciousness. "You're Force-sensitive," Voss said, and his voice carried equal parts disbelief and recognition. "Recently awakened by the feel of it, raw and completely untrained. How is this possible? You're Jango Fett's clone," and he showed no sensitivity to the Force. "I don't know how it's possible." Fett holstered his blaster, a gesture of tentative trust that went against every instinct. "I found something on Tatooine, a crystal in a cavern with ancient carvings. It triggered visions, and now I can feel things I shouldn't be able to feel." Voss ran a hand through his dreadlocks, his Force presence projecting a mixture of concern and intense curiosity. "A Kyber crystal, probably. They're attuned to the Force, used in lightsaber construction. But they don't grant Force sensitivity, they amplify what's already there." He paused, studying Fett with uncomfortable intensity. "It must have been dormant in you all along, buried so deep that even you didn't know it existed. Vader knows now." Fett outlined the encounter on Tatooine in clipped, efficient sentences. "He marked me. He'll hunt me. Of course he will." Voss moved deeper into the tunnel, gesturing for Fett to follow. "You're exactly the kind of asset the Emperor would want, a hunter with your reputation augmented by Force powers. They'll try to turn you into an Inquisitor or something worse. Unless you learn to shield yourself." Voss led him into a small chamber that appeared to be living quarters. A bunk, a footlocker, various pieces of equipment that suggested a man ready to run at a moment's notice. Untrained Force sensitives broadcast their presence like a beacon. Anyone with the ability to sense the Force can feel you from systems away, but with training, you can learn to hide, to become a shadow in the Force. It's called Force concealment. Fett considered the offer, weighing risks against benefits with the same calculation he brought to every contract negotiation. Training with a Jedi, even a fallen one, carried dangers that extended beyond simple tactical considerations. It meant opening himself to influence, to philosophy, to the possibility that he might become something other than what Jango Fett had crafted. But the alternative was to remain exposed, a target for Vader and the Inquisitorius, a beacon calling every Force user in the galaxy to either claim or destroy him. "Teach me," Fett said. Voss smiled, but it carried no warmth. "This isn't going to be pleasant. Force training requires you to lower your guards, to open yourself to vulnerability. Everything I've learned about you suggests that goes against your core nature. I've survived worse than discomfort. We'll see." The training began immediately, without ceremony or preparation. Voss cleared a space in the center of his quarters, gesturing for Fett to remove his armor. "You can't feel the Force properly through all that Beskar and electronics. Strip down to your bodysuit." Fett hesitated, his hand unconsciously moving to his helmet. Without his armor, he was just a man. Exposed. Mortal. Every piece of equipment represented layers of protection that had kept him alive through conflicts that killed entire armies. "Do you want to learn or not?" Voss's tone carried challenge more than question. Fett began removing armor plates. Each piece came off with the reluctance of someone peeling away their own skin. Helmet. Chest plate. Gauntlets. Shoulder guards. Knee pads. The armor piled beside him like a shed exoskeleton until he stood in only his black bodysuit and boots, feeling nakedly vulnerable for the first time in decades. Voss circled him slowly, his Force senses apparently mapping Fett's newly awakened abilities. "You're leaking energy like a cracked reactor. Anger, fear, determination, all of it broadcasting across the Force without filter or control. Vader probably felt you activate before you even realized what was happening. How do I stop it?" "You don't stop it. You contain it." Voss settled into a seated position, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees. "Sit, mirror my position." Fett sat, his body settling into the unfamiliar posture with mechanical precision. "Now close your eyes." "That seems tactically inadvisable." "Boba." Voss's voice carried a note of exasperation. "If I wanted to kill you, I would have done it while you were removing your armor." "Close your eyes." Fett complied, his other senses immediately sharpening to compensate for the loss of sight. He could hear the ambient hum of the station's life support systems, the distant roar of crowds in the arena above. Voss's controlled breathing. "Feel the Force moving through you," Voss said, his voice taking on the quality of instruction rather than conversation. "Don't try to control it yet, just observe. Notice how it flows in response to your emotions. When you feel anger, the Force surges. When you feel fear, it contracts. The key to concealment is learning to make that flow so smooth and natural that it becomes invisible against the background noise of the living Force." Fett tried to do as instructed, turning his attention inward to the strange new sense that had awakened on Tatooine. The Force felt like electricity in his veins, like pressure behind his eyes, like a sound pitched just beyond the range of normal hearing. And Voss was right. It responded to his emotional state with disturbing sensitivity. When he thought about Vader, the Force spiked with fury and fear. When he thought about his father, it rippled with complicated patterns he could not fully interpret. "You're fighting it," Voss observed. "Stop trying to push it down. That only makes you more visible. Instead, imagine your water flowing in a river. Water doesn't resist. It simply moves along the path of least resistance. I'm not water. I'm a hunter. And that attitude is going to get you killed." Voss's tone sharpened. "The Force isn't a weapon you pick up when you need it and set aside when you don't. It's part of you now. It's been part of you all along, buried under layers of trauma and suppression. If you want to survive, you need to accept that. The word trauma hung in the air between them, resonating with implications that Fett refused to examine. He was not traumatized, he was functional. His childhood on Kamino had been challenging but necessary. His father's death had been unfortunate but instructive. Everything that had happened to him had served to forge him into the galaxy's most effective bounty hunter. And yet, the Force showed him things he had buried. Loneliness on Kamino while his clone brothers marched to war. Grief at the arena when Jango Fett's head hit the sand. Rage at the Jedi for taking his father. Rage at the Republic for using him as a template. Rage at a galaxy that had ground him down and called it making him strong. The Force surged in response to those emotions, crackling around him like visible lightning, and somewhere in the back of his mind he felt Vader's attention turn toward the wheel like a predator catching a scent. "Control it," Voss said urgently. "Pull it back, or every Inquisitor within 10 parsecs will triangulate your location." Fett struggled, his discipline warring against instinct, his need for control fighting the fundamental requirement to surrender. The Force did not respond to force. It required something else, something he had spent his entire life learning to excise from his personality. Trust. The realization was bitter as poison, but he had survived worse. He let go. Not completely, not with the absolute surrender that Jedi philosophy demanded, but enough to stop fighting against the current and instead begin moving with it. The Force calmed fractionally, the lightning faded, and in the darkness behind his closed eyes, he felt his presence in the Force diminish from a blazing beacon to something smaller and more controlled, still visible, but no longer screaming his location to anyone with the sense to listen. "Better," Voss said, and his voice carried genuine approval. "You have instincts for this that usually take years to develop, probably because you've been unconsciously using Force abilities your whole life and attributing them to skill or genetics." Fett opened his eyes, finding Voss watching him with an expression that mixed teacher's pride with hunter's assessment. "How long until I can hide completely?" "Weeks. Months. It depends on how fast you learn and how much time we have before the Empire finds us. Then we start now." They trained for 6 hours without interruption, Voss drilling him through meditation exercises that felt more like combat than enlightenment. Every time Fett's concentration slipped, every time his emotions spiked, Voss would strike him with a force push that sent him sprawling across the chamber. It was brutal, effective, and exactly the kind of teaching method that Fett could understand. Pain was an excellent instructor. By the 6th hour, he could maintain a meditative state for up to 3 minutes without his presence in the Force flaring into visibility. It was not true concealment, not the complete disappearance that skilled Jedi could achieve, but it represented measurable progress. Voss called a halt when Fett's concentration finally broke completely. "You're done for now. Your mind is exhausted, even if your body isn't. Force training depletes you in ways that physical exercise doesn't." Fett stood, his body moving through the stiffness that came with prolonged stillness. "When do we continue? Tomorrow? Maybe." Voss moved to his footlocker, extracting a bottle of something amber and potent-looking. "There's a complication." "What complication?" "I felt you tracking me 3 years ago." Voss poured 2 glasses of the amber liquid, offering one to Fett. "I knew you had compiled a profile on me. I knew you were deciding whether to report my location to the Empire. And when you didn't, I assumed you had simply calculated that the bounty wasn't worth the risk." "That was my calculation. Was it?" Voss took a long drink, his eyes never leaving Fett's face. "Or did some part of you recognize that we're not so different? Both of us walking the line between light and dark, both of us doing questionable things to survive in a galaxy that wants us dead or controlled." Fett did not answer, because the question cut too close to considerations he had been avoiding since Tatooine. He had always believed himself separate from Force users, distinct from their religious conflicts and mystical philosophies. But if Voss was right, if he had been unconsciously wielding Force abilities his entire life, then perhaps that separation had been an illusion maintained through willful ignorance. Perhaps he had always been one of them. He drank the amber liquid, which burned like fire going down his throat. "I need to know something," Fett said after the burning faded. "When you use the Force, When you reach out with it to accomplish something, how do you decide which path to follow, light or dark? Voss laughed, but it carried no humor. That's the question, isn't it? The Jedi would tell you there's a clear distinction, that the light side flows from peace and serenity, while the dark side comes from passion and aggression. But living in the real galaxy shows you that distinction isn't nearly so clean. Sometimes you need anger to survive. Sometimes peace is just another word for surrender. So you use both. I use what works. Voss refilled his glass. The Force doesn't care about our moral categories. It simply exists, like gravity or time. We're the ones who impose meaning on it. The philosophy resonated with something in Fett's core understanding of the galaxy. He had never believed in absolute good or evil, had always understood the universe as a collection of competing interests and survival strategies. If the Force was truly neutral, if it could be wielded without subscribing to Jedi passivity or Sith domination, then perhaps there was a path forward that did not require him to become something he was not. Teach me to use it, Fett said. Not as a Jedi, not as a Sith, as what I am. Voss studied him for a long moment, his Force senses apparently reading layers of intention and determination that speech could not convey. That's a dangerous path, Boba. Without the Jedi code to provide boundaries or the Sith philosophy to channel ambition, you'll be navigating by instinct alone. And instinct can lead to places darker than you can imagine. I've been navigating by instinct my entire life. Then I suppose we'll see where it leads. The training continued for 3 weeks, during which Fett learned to feel the Force not as an external power, but as an extension of his own awareness. Voss taught him to enhance his physical abilities through Force augmentation, to sense danger before it manifested, to influence weak minds through subtle manipulation of their perceptions. But more importantly, he taught Fett to conceal his presence, to wrap himself in layers of mental discipline that made his Force signature vanish beneath the threshold of detection. It was not invisibility, it was camouflage of the highest order. During the 4th week, everything changed. Fett was meditating in Voss's quarters, his consciousness extended through the Force to map the ebb and flow of life across the wheel's vast structure, when he felt something that made his eyes snap open in alarm. Darkness. Approaching from multiple vectors. Cold and purposeful and terrifyingly familiar. Inquisitors. He recognized their Force signatures from intelligence briefings and close-call encounters. Dark side users who served the Empire as Jedi hunters, each one trained in the ancient Sith arts by Vader himself. There were 3 of them, moving through the station with predatory patience, their combined presence in the Force painting the wheel in shades of crimson and shadow. They were hunting Force sensitives, and despite Fett's training, despite 3 weeks of practice in concealment, he could feel their attention beginning to turn in his direction. Voss burst into the chamber, his face tight with controlled fear. They found us. We need to move now. Fett was already donning his armor, his hands moving through the familiar motions with speed born of countless emergency extractions. How did they track us? Does it matter? Voss grabbed his own equipment, what little he kept in this temporary sanctuary. The Empire must have informants throughout the station. Someone saw us training or felt the Force disturbances. Either way, we're compromised. The armor settled around Fett like a second skin, each plate clicking into place with mechanical certainty. He checked his weapons, confirming ammunition and charge levels, his tactical mind already mapping extraction routes and defensive positions. But something had changed in his approach to combat planning. Now he could feel the enemy approaching through the Force, could sense their intentions and emotional states, could predict their movements with accuracy that transcended tactical analysis. He was no longer just a hunter. He was something else. Something the galaxy did not yet have a name for. The main docking bay is too exposed, Fett said, his helmet's sensors syncing with the wheel's security grid through illegal access codes. They'll have it covered. We need a secondary route. There's a maintenance elevator that connects to the outer hull, Voss said, already moving toward the chamber's rear exit. Service craft use it for emergency repairs. If we can reach it before they seal the station. An explosion rocked the tunnel outside, showering them with debris and filling the air with smoke that smelled of burning metal and ozone. Through the Force, Fett felt one of the Inquisitors approaching, their lightsaber already ignited, crimson light painting the smoke in shades of blood. "Too late," Fett said. He raised his blaster and fired through the smoke, his shots guided by Force-enhanced perception that showed him the enemy's location with crystalline clarity. The Inquisitor deflected each bolt with their spinning lightsaber, the crimson blade moving in patterns that would have been impossible to track without Force assistance. But Fett was not fighting as a normal hunter anymore. He was adapting, predicting, allowing the Force to flow through him without the discipline of Jedi philosophy or the hunger of Sith doctrine. He was simply fighting to survive, and survival had always been his greatest talent. Fett triggered his wrist-mounted flamethrower, sending a gout of liquid fire through the smoke that forced the Inquisitor to retreat. In that moment of respite, he grabbed Voss and pulled him toward the maintenance tunnel, his armor's sensors painting an escape route through smoke and shadow. Behind them, he felt the other two Inquisitors converging, their presence in the Force like knives pressing against his awareness. They reached the maintenance elevator through sheer momentum and tactical efficiency, Voss slicing the control panel with a lightsaber he had apparently been concealing all along. The lift descended with agonizing slowness, its ancient mechanism groaning against disuse, while above them the Inquisitors breached into the shaft. "How far to the hull?" Fett asked, his blaster tracking the shaft above them. 400 meters. Maybe less. Voss was breathing hard, his Force presence flickering with exhaustion and stress. "They're going to follow us out there. Fighting on the hull with no gravity is going to be suicide. Fighting inside was also suicide." Fett armed every weapon system his armor possessed, preparing for a confrontation that would likely end in his death. "At least in vacuum I have jetpack advantage." The elevator reached the maintenance level, its doors opening onto a narrow corridor that smelled of recycled air and machine oil. Through his helmet sensors, Fett could see the hull access hatch ahead, a circular portal that separated pressurized interior from the endless void beyond. His fingers flew across the access panel, overriding safety locks and pumping protocols that were designed to prevent explosive decompression. "Seal your suit," Fett ordered. Voss produced a breath mask from his jacket, securing it over his nose and mouth. "This is going to be unpleasant." "Most things are." Fett triggered the hatch. The atmosphere exploded outward with force enough to tear loose equipment off the walls and send smaller objects tumbling into space. Fett's mag boots activated automatically, locking him to the deck plating, while Voss used the Force to anchor himself against the violent decompression. They moved through the open hatch together, emerging onto the wheel's outer hull, where starlight and station illumination painted everything in contrasts of absolute black and brilliant white. The Inquisitors followed. 3 figures in dark armor, their lightsabers ignited against the void, their Force presence burning like miniature suns against the emptiness of space. They spread out with tactical precision, flanking positions designed to divide attention and create killing zones. Without atmosphere to carry sound, the battle would be silent, a dance of light and death conducted in perfect vacuum. Fett opened fire. His blaster bolts lanced across the hull, each shot guided by Force-enhanced targeting that compensated for zero gravity and vacuum physics. But the Inquisitors moved like shadows given form, their lightsabers deflecting what they could not dodge, their Force-assisted movement allowing them to leap and spin in ways that violated every law of inertia. He had fought Force users before, but never with his own connection to the Force active, never with the ability to feel their intentions before they manifested in action. It changed everything. One Inquisitor launched a telekinetic attack, invisible force meant to crush Fett's armor like tin. He felt it coming, moved with it rather than against it, allowing the Force push to spin him across the hull while his jetpack compensated for lost momentum. His return strike came from an unexpected angle, a wrist rocket that the Inquisitor barely deflected in time. Beside him, Voss engaged the second Inquisitor in lightsaber combat, green blade against red, their weapons throwing weird shadows across the curved hull. The Jedi was good, his style incorporating elements of multiple forms, but the Inquisitor was trained by Vader himself and fought with the cold efficiency of someone who had hunted dozens of Jedi to extinction. The third Inquisitor came for Fett. They moved across the hull with inhuman speed, their double-bladed lightsaber spinning in a pattern that created a wall of crimson light. Fett fired, rolled, activated his flamethrower in a move that should have been impossible in vacuum, but somehow worked because the fuel's propellant was oxygen-independent. The Inquisitor emerged from the flames untouched, their lightsaber coming down in an overhead strike that would have split Fett's helmet if he had been a fraction of a second slower. But he was not slower. The Force had made him faster. He felt the lightsaber's arc before it descended, moved before conscious thought could interfere, and drove his fibercord whip toward the Inquisitor's midsection in a strike aimed at joints and weak points in their armor. The cord wrapped around their waist, his armor's winch system contracting with force enough to draw them closer. Close enough for his wrist-mounted vibroblade to deploy. The blade punched through the Inquisitor's armor with an impact he felt through his entire arm. Blood erupted in a sphere of frozen droplets that scattered across the hull like grotesque stars. The Inquisitor staggered, their lightsaber falling from nerveless fingers, their presence in the Force flickering like a candle caught in wind. Fett pulled the vibroblade free and watched them drift away into the void. First kill. But the battle was far from over. Vos was losing ground against his opponent, his Force reserves clearly depleted by weeks of training and the stress of combat. The Inquisitor pressed their advantage with methodical brutality, each strike designed to exhaust rather than kill immediately. They were toying with him, demonstrating superiority, making an example of a fallen Jedi who had dared to operate outside Imperial control. Fett would not allow it. He crossed the distance between them in 3 jetpack bursts, his angle of approach calculated to avoid Vos's line of engagement while presenting the Inquisitor with a new threat from an unexpected vector. His EE-3 carbine barked 3 times in rapid succession, each shot aimed at joints and weak points that his Force-enhanced perception identified as vulnerable. The Inquisitor spun to engage him, their lightsaber moving in a defensive pattern, giving Vos the opening he needed. The Jedi's green blade lanced forward, punching through the Inquisitor's guard and finding the gap between chestplate and shoulder armor. The Inquisitor convulsed, their Force presence exploding outward in a dying scream that only those with the sensitivity to hear could perceive. Second kill. The third Inquisitor, seeing 2 of their number eliminated, made the tactical decision to retreat. They disengaged from the hull with a Force-assisted leap that sent them tumbling toward a nearby transport that had apparently been waiting in standby position. Fett considered pursuit, calculated odds, and determined that the effort would expend resources he could not spare. Let them run. Let them report to Vader that Boba Fett could not be taken easily. Let the Empire know that he was no longer prey. Vos sagged against the hull, his breath mask fogging with exertion. Through their shared connection to the Force, Fett felt the Jedi's exhaustion like a physical weight. He moved to support him, activating his mag boots to anchor them both while his free hand worked the access controls for the hull hatch. They returned to the wheel's interior through emergency protocols and maintenance corridors, avoiding security cameras and witness testimony through liberal application of Force suggestion and threatening posture. By the time they reached the docking bays where Slave Eye waited, both of them were running on fumes and determination. "Where will you go?" Vos asked as they stood beside Fett's ship, the question carrying weight that transcended simple curiosity. "Away from here. Away from anywhere the Empire expects." Fett paused, considering something he had never imagined himself considering. "You should come with me." Vos smiled, but it carried sadness. "I appreciate the offer, but our paths diverge here. You're walking a line I tried to walk for years, and it nearly destroyed me. The only reason I survived is because I eventually accepted that I needed to choose a side. You're not ready to make that choice yet. Maybe I'll never be ready. Maybe." Vos extended his hand, a gesture that Fett recognized as farewell. "But when you finally have to choose between the light and the dark, between the Jedi's peace and the Sith's power, remember that there's strength in acknowledging your limitations. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be honest about what you're becoming." Fett clasped the offered hand briefly, then released it and turned toward his ship. He did not look back as he climbed the boarding ramp. He did not watch as the ramp cycled closed behind him. He simply initiated launch sequences and departed from the wheel with the kind of clean break that had defined his entire life. Behind him, he felt Voss's presence in the Force diminish as distance grew. Ahead, the galaxy waited with all its dangers and possibilities. Somewhere in the core worlds, Vader was searching for him. Somewhere in the outer rim, contracts bore his name and promised wealth beyond measure. Somewhere in the balance between light and dark, between Jedi philosophy and Sith hunger, a path existed that might allow him to remain what he was while becoming something more. Fett set his navigation computer to jump to a random set of coordinates in the unknown regions, somewhere far from Imperial reach and prying Force-sensitive awareness. As the stars stretched into the familiar tunnel of hyperspace, he allowed himself a moment of reflection that would have seemed foreign 3 weeks earlier. He was Force-sensitive. He could no longer deny it or suppress it, or pretend it was merely genetic advantage. And that meant his entire understanding of himself, of his father's legacy, of his place in the galaxy, required re-evaluation. Jango Fett had been a warrior of legendary skill, a man who commanded respect through martial prowess and cold professionalism. But he had not been Force-sensitive, or if he had been, the trait had remained dormant throughout his entire life. So where had Boba's ability come from? Some recessive gene that the Kaminoans had not accounted for? Some mutation introduced during the cloning process? Or was it possible that Jango himself had possessed latent Force sensitivity, buried so deep that even he had not recognized it? The questions spiraled without resolution. What mattered was the present. Fett had power now, raw and largely untrained, but undeniably real. The Force responded to his will, enhanced his reflexes, showed him possibilities that mundane perception could not access, and Vader wanted to claim that power for the Empire. The thought filled him with rage that made the Force surge through his veins like liquid fire. He would not be claimed, would not be controlled, would not allow the Empire or anyone else to reduce him to a tool in someone else's arsenal. He had spent his entire life maintaining independence, operating outside factional conflicts, serving only his own interests and the contracts he chose to accept. That would not change. The Force would not change it. But perhaps it could make him more effective. Perhaps it could transform him from merely the best bounty hunter in the galaxy into something without precedent, a Force-sensitive mercenary who served no master and subscribed to no philosophy beyond his own survival and profit. The concept carried elegance and danger. Without the Jedi code to provide moral boundaries or the Sith philosophy to channel ambition towards specific ends, he would be charting territory that few, if any, had successfully navigated. Quinlan Vos had walked that line and nearly fallen into darkness. Others had tried and failed completely, their names forgotten by history or remembered only as cautionary tales. But Fett had always thrived in spaces where others failed. His entire existence was predicated on succeeding where success seemed impossible. He would adapt, he would survive, and he would make the galaxy pay handsomely for the privilege of employing his services. The journey through hyperspace lasted 2 days, during which he planned his next moves with the methodical precision that had always characterized his approach to long-term strategy. He needed resources, credits, equipment, information. More importantly, he needed to establish a reputation as someone who could not be tracked through the Force, someone who had learned to hide his presence so effectively that even Vader's Inquisitors could not hunt him down. That meant more training, but Vos had been clear. Their paths diverged, which meant Fett needed a different teacher, or perhaps no teacher at all. He had learned Mandalorian combat techniques largely through observation and self-directed practice, studying holographic recordings of his father's fights and adapting those techniques to his own physiology and tactical preferences. Perhaps Force training could follow the same model. Ancient temples existed throughout the galaxy, ruins left behind by Jedi and Sith civilizations that had risen and fallen over millennia. Some contained holocrons, crystalline data storage devices that held recorded teachings from long-dead Force users. If he could locate such artifacts, if he could study them without interference from Empire or rebellion, he might learn to refine his abilities without submitting to anyone's authority. The plan formed with the clarity of crystal. Step 1. Establish secure base of operations in the unknown regions, somewhere Imperial sensors could not easily penetrate. Step 2. Research locations of ancient Force temples and ruins, prioritizing sites least likely to be under Imperial surveillance. Step 3. Systematically raid those sites for holocrons and other training materials. Step 4. Continue accepting contracts that aligned with his financial goals, while avoiding anything that might expose him to Vader's direct attention. Simple, efficient, survivable. Slave Eye emerged from hyperspace in a stellar neighborhood that existed on no Imperial charts, a collection of rocky planetoids orbiting a dim red dwarf that barely produced enough radiation to illuminate the system. Fett selected the largest planetoid, one with sufficient gravity to anchor his ship and a thin atmosphere that would allow him to move outside without full environmental suits. He established a temporary base in a crater that offered natural concealment from passing scans, deploying sensor baffles and holographic projectors that would mask the base's signature from anyone not looking for it specifically. His first week in isolation was spent acclimating to his newly awakened senses. Without the constant noise of civilization, without the pressure of immediate threats or tactical concerns, he could finally feel the Force flowing through him without distraction. It was vast, incomprehensibly vast. A network of connections that linked every living thing in the galaxy, from the smallest microorganism to the most complex sentient consciousness. And he was part of that network now, undeniably and irrevocably. The realization brought neither comfort nor distress. It simply was. He began experimenting with basic abilities that Voss had outlined but not fully explored. Telekinesis came naturally, probably because it aligned with his existing instinct to manipulate his environment through technological means. He started with small objects, his helmet, a blaster power cell, a piece of scrap metal. Lifting them with the Force felt like flexing a muscle he had never realized existed, exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with physical effort. But he improved rapidly. Within days, he could manipulate multiple objects simultaneously, could throw them with enough force to embed them in stone, could create barriers of telekinetic pressure that deflected incoming projectiles. It was not elegant. It lacked the refined control that centuries of Jedi training produced, but it was effective, which was all that mattered. Force perception proved more challenging. Voss had taught him to sense immediate danger and nearby presences, but extending that awareness across stellar distances required a level of concentration that Fett found difficult to maintain. His mind kept returning to tactical considerations, profit calculations, target locations, and contract negotiations. The meditative state required for deep Force perception felt foreign to his nature, incompatible with the constant vigilance that had kept him alive. Perhaps some abilities would remain beyond his reach, or perhaps they simply required different approaches. He abandoned traditional meditation and instead began incorporating Force awareness into his existing routines. When he maintained his weapons, he reached out with the Force to feel the flow of energy through power cells and firing mechanisms. When he planned tactical scenarios, he used the Force to model possible outcomes and identify strategic vulnerabilities. When he exercised, he enhanced his physical performance with Force augmentation that pushed his body beyond its normal limits. The Force became a tool, not a religion or a lifestyle, but simply another resource to be exploited in service of his survival and success. It felt right. On the 20th day of his isolation, he received his first contract since Tatooine. The message arrived through an encrypted channel that bounced through 17 relay stations before reaching his secure communication array. The client was anonymous, as many were, but the offer was legitimate. 50,000 credits for the capture and delivery of a Rhodian smuggler named Tico, who had stolen a shipment of weapons-grade baradium from a Hutt cartel. The target was believed to be hiding in the corporate sector, probably on Eti 4. Standard work, low risk, reasonable profit. Fett accepted the contract and plotted a course out of the unknown regions. Eti IV was a sprawling ecumenopolis, an entire planet covered in urban development that housed billions of sentients from hundreds of species. Finding one Rhodian smuggler in that chaos would normally require weeks of investigation and careful information gathering. But Fett had an advantage now. He extended his force awareness across the planet's surface as his ship descended through standard approach vectors, feeling for the distinctive presence of fear and paranoia that marked someone on the run. He found Tico in 4 hours. The Rhodian was hiding in a mid-level residential district, his force presence radiating anxiety like a beacon. Fett observed from a rooftop across the street, his helmet's sensors confirming what the force had already shown him. One target, lightly armed, no backup, vulnerable and isolated. Almost too easy. Suspicion prickled at the back of his mind. He extended his force senses further, mapping the building and surrounding area for threats he might have missed. And there, hidden in a cargo transport parked 2 blocks away, he felt other presences, 3 of them, heavily armed, waiting with the patient stillness of professionals. An ambush, but aimed at whom? Fett reviewed the contract details again, this time looking for inconsistencies he had missed during his initial evaluation. The client had been anonymous, but the payment had cleared through legitimate channels. The target's crimes were documented through public records. Everything appeared genuine, except the force was screaming warning. He retreated from the rooftop and repositioned 3 blocks away, his tactical mind analyzing possibilities. If someone knew about his force sensitivity, if they had set up this contract specifically to lure him into a trap, then the ambush team would likely include force users or weapons designed to counter force abilities. But if the trap was meant for the Rhodian, if Tico had crossed someone more dangerous than simple Hutt enforcers, then Fett's intervention might expose him to factional conflicts better avoided. Either way, completing this contract carried risks that exceeded the profit margin. He considered abandoning the job entirely. His reputation could withstand one declined contract, but abandoning felt wrong in ways that had nothing to do with professional pride. The Force was showing him something, offering him an opportunity to test his newly developed abilities against real-world opposition, and he had always learned best through direct experience. Decision made. Fett approached the ambush team's position from an unexpected vector, his force concealment wrapping around him like a shroud of invisibility. The 3 ambushers were human, dressed in nondescript armor that suggested freelance mercenaries rather than imperial or criminal organization affiliation. Their weapons were impressive: sonic disruptors, neural shock nets, stun grenades designed for capturing rather than killing. Bounty hunters, competing for the same contract, or waiting to claim Fett's bounty. He would know soon enough. Fett activated his helmet's audio pickups, filtering background noise until he could hear their conversation through the transport's hull. He should have shown up by now, one of them was saying, voice distorted by their helmet's vocabulator. Intel said Fett always moves fast on these contracts. Maybe he got wise to the setup, or maybe he's already inside, collecting the target while we sit here with our thumbs up. Fett triggered an electromagnetic pulse through his wrist-mounted generator, frying the transport's electronic systems and plunging the interior into darkness. The ambushers reacted with professional speed, their weapons coming up even as they moved toward the rear exit. But Fett was already there, his presence concealed by force-assisted stealth, his blaster targeting the first mercenary through the opening. One stun bolt to the helmet at close range. The mercenary dropped. The second one pivoted, bringing their sonic disruptor to bear, but Fett moved before the trigger pull, his force-enhanced reflexes allowing him to slip inside the weapon's effective range. His armored fist connected with the mercenary's jaw, hard enough to crack bone and send them sprawling backward. The third mercenary was smarter. They triggered a flash grenade that filled the transport with blinding light and disorienting sonics. Without force awareness, Fett would have been incapacitated. With it, he felt the grenade's activation before detonation and closed his eyes while enhancing his other senses through the force. He moved through the chaos like water, each step precisely calculated, until his hands found the third mercenary's throat. One efficient twist. Silence. Fett secured the unconscious survivors with their own neural shock nets, stripping them of identification and communication devices. A thorough search revealed what he had suspected. These were not random bounty hunters. They carried Imperial authorization codes and orders to capture Boba Fett alive for questioning regarding his connection to Force-sensitive activity. Vader had moved faster than anticipated. The Empire was not waiting for Fett to expose himself through careless use of Force abilities. They were actively hunting him, using bounty contracts as bait and mercenary teams as proxies, which meant every job he accepted carried the potential for similar traps. Every target might be surveillance designed to map his movements and capabilities. His isolation strategy had just become significantly more complicated. Fett considered his options while recovering Tico from the residential building. The Rodian came quietly, his relief at being captured by Fett rather than whoever had been waiting in the transport palpable through the Force. Fett delivered him to the designated collection point without incident, claimed his payment, and departed from Eti IV, with the growing certainty that his life had just become exponentially more dangerous. The Empire would not stop. Vader would not stop. And eventually, through weight of numbers or strategic patience, they would corner him, unless he gave them something else to focus on. The idea formed slowly, crystallizing over days of hyperspace travel as he moved between contracts and avoided Imperial entanglements. What if he allowed himself to be found? Not captured, but observed. What if he demonstrated that his Force abilities made him more valuable as an independent operator than as an Imperial asset? What if he could convince the Empire that attempting to control him would cost more than simply utilizing his services through traditional bounty contracts? It was audacious, potentially suicidal, and exactly the kind of calculated risk that had defined his most successful operations. Fett began researching Imperial operations that aligned with his skill set, contracts that would bring him into proximity with Imperial authority without placing him directly in Vader's reach. He found what he needed within 3 days, a high-value target named Commodore Titus, an Imperial officer who had defected to the rebellion with classified information about fleet movements. The bounty was posted by Imperial intelligence, the payment was substantial, and the contract specified that Titus must be delivered alive to an Imperial facility on Scarif. Perfect. Fett accepted the contract through official channels, ensuring his acceptance would register in Imperial databases and draw appropriate attention. Then he began the hunt, with the full knowledge that his every move was being observed, analyzed, catalogued by Imperial analysts, who were simultaneously assessing his capabilities and determining how to neutralize or exploit him. He would show them exactly what they wanted to see, and nothing more. Commodore Titus had established a rebellion safe house on Crate, a remote mineral planet in the Outer Rim. The planet's surface was covered in salt flats that made approach and surveillance trivially easy for anyone with decent sensors. But the rebellion had excavated a base into the old mining tunnels beneath the surface, creating a warren of interconnected chambers that could house hundreds of personnel and dozens of starfighters. Fett arrived in Slave 1 under false transponder codes, his approach vector suggesting a transport hauler rather than a bounty hunter's pursuit craft. His Force senses showed him the rebellion's sensor network before his ship's systems detected it, allowing him to navigate through gaps in their coverage that should not have been apparent. First demonstration. He landed 50 kilometers from the main base entrance, concealing his ship beneath camouflage netting before beginning the approach on foot. The salt flats offered no cover, no concealment, nothing but endless white expanse beneath a pale sky. Anyone crossing them would be visible for dozens of kilometers, which made the rebellion's defensive strategy obvious: detect intruders early and deploy superior firepower before they could reach the base. Fett crossed the flats in 4 hours, his Force concealment wrapped so tightly around him that he registered as nothing more than a minor atmospheric anomaly to the rebellion's sensors. His armor's adaptive camouflage helped, its surface shifting to match the crystalline texture of the salt, but the real advantage came from his ability to suppress his presence in the Force until he seemed like a void, a nothing space that awareness simply slid past without registering. Second demonstration. He reached the base entrance as night fell, the temperature plummeting to levels that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. Rebellion sentries stood watch in insulated gear, their weapons tracking across empty approaches, while their attention flickered between boredom and hypervigilance. Fett moved past them like a ghost, his force concealment maintaining even as he entered the tunnels and began navigating through corridors carved from ancient mineral deposits. Finding Titus required accessing the base's security network, which Fett accomplished through physical infiltration of their command center. He moved through the facility like he had memorized its layout in advance, which in a sense he had. The Force showed him paths of least resistance, showed him where sentries would look and where they would not, showed him the flow of personnel through the tunnels like watching currents in a vast underground river. Third demonstration. Titus occupied a private chamber in the base's officer section, protected by reinforced doors and guard rotations that should have made him unreachable. Fett bypassed the doors through careful application of force manipulation, telekinetically triggering locks from the inside, while his armor's electronics created the proper authorization signals. The guards never realized their defenses had been compromised until Fett was already inside the chamber with a blaster pressed against Titus's temple. "Imperial intelligence wants you alive," Fett said quietly, "but the contract allows for injuries if you resist." Titus was a career officer, trained to assess tactical situations and recognize when continued resistance served no purpose. "How did you get past the base's defenses? How did you get past the guards? Does it matter?" "It matters to me. I designed most of those security protocols myself." Fett considered the question, weighing the value of maintaining operational security against the benefit of allowing the Empire to understand exactly what they were dealing with. "I have abilities your protocols don't account for. You're force-sensitive." Titus's eyes widened with understanding. "That's why Vader wants you so badly. A bounty hunter who can use the Force without Jedi ideology or Sith chains. Let's go, Commodore." The extraction through the base proved more challenging than the infiltration, primarily because Fett was no longer operating alone, and Titus's bulk made stealth approach nearly impossible. But the Force provided solutions that mundane tactics could not access. When guards approached, Fett used subtle Force suggestion to redirect their attention. When security checkpoints threatened to expose them, he manipulated sensor readings through telekinetic pressure on key components. When alarm protocols finally triggered, he created a telekinetic barrier that deflected blaster fire long enough for them to reach the surface. Fourth demonstration. The journey across the salt flats occurred under heavy pursuit, rebellion soldiers and T-47 airspeeders converging from multiple vectors. Fett's jetpack carried them both in arcing trajectories that standard pursuit vehicles could not match, his force-enhanced piloting allowing him to execute maneuvers that violated basic physics. Blaster fire streaked past them, explosive rounds detonating close enough to feel the pressure waves, but Fett moved through the chaos with the certainty of someone who could see every possible future and chose the one where he survived. Fifth demonstration. They reached Slave 1 with a 15-second margin before the rebellion's air support would have closed the distance. Fett secured Titus in a holding cell, initiated launch sequences, and cleared atmosphere before the base could mobilize their capital ship defenses. As the stars appeared overhead and hyperspace calculations completed, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The operation had been flawless, demonstrative, and absolutely guaranteed to have been monitored by Imperial intelligence assets embedded within the rebellion. Scarif appeared ahead of him through hyperspace, a tropical world dominated by massive data storage facilities and Imperial military infrastructure. Fett transmitted his arrival codes and received clearance to land at the intelligence headquarters, a vast complex of black stone and reinforced transparasteel that projected power through architectural intimidation. He delivered Titus to the designated receiving area, where Imperial officers processed the transfer with bureaucratic efficiency. The payment cleared instantly into his accounts, 50,000 credits that represented barely a fraction of what this demonstration was worth. Because payment was not the goal, recognition was the goal, and recognition came 3 hours later. Fett was performing routine maintenance on Slave 1 when his ship's communication array received a priority transmission on a secure Imperial frequency. The encryption was military-grade, the authorization codes traced back to the Imperial flagship executor. and the voice that emerged from his speakers carried mechanical rhythm that Fett would recognize anywhere. Boba Fett. Vader's voice filled the cockpit like darkness given sound. Your capture of Commodore Titus was impressive. You demonstrated abilities that suggest significant development since our encounter on Tatooine. Fett did not respond immediately, his tactical mind analyzing the Sith Lord's words for trapdoors and hidden threats. The contract specified alive. I delivered alive. You delivered perfection. Something in Vader's tone suggested approval, which was somehow more terrifying than rage. The Emperor has been informed of your capabilities. He wishes to offer you exclusive contracts that would utilize your unique talents in service of Imperial objectives. I work for credits, not ideology. Credits are easily provided. Your fee for the Titus contract is being increased by a factor of 10 as a gesture of Imperial appreciation. 500,000 credits. For a single contract. The amount was staggering, enough to fund equipment upgrades and operational expenses for years. But Fett understood what was really being offered. A golden leash, comfort purchased at the cost of independence. What happens if I decline? Fett asked. Then the Empire continues to view you as a valuable independent contractor. No coercion will be attempted, no mandates issued. You will simply be offered first consideration for contracts that match your demonstrated capabilities. It was too reasonable, too clean, which meant Vader was lying or playing a game with rules that Fett could not yet perceive, but refusing outright would achieve nothing except making him a target again. Better to accept the credits, take the contracts that aligned with his interests, and maintain the fiction of cooperation while actually preserving his autonomy. I accept the Emperor's appreciation, Fett said carefully, and I'll consider future contracts on their individual merits. That is all the Empire requires. Vader's respirator cycled twice before continuing. One word of caution, Bounty Hunter. Your Force abilities have not gone unnoticed by others beyond Imperial authority. The Rebellion will seek to recruit you. Criminal syndicates will attempt to bind you through debt or obligation. And there are Force-sensitive individuals throughout the galaxy who will view you as either ally or threat. Choose your associations carefully. The transmission ended. Fett sat in his cockpit for long minutes afterward, his Force senses extended to their limit, searching for any indication that Imperial assets were moving to surround his position. But Scarif's orbital space remained clear of threat signatures. The Imperial personnel who had received Titus showed no indication of hostile intent. Everything appeared exactly as Vader had promised, which meant the Sith Lord was playing a longer game, allowing Fett freedom now in order to observe how he used it, cataloging his abilities and limitations through field observation rather than direct interrogation, building a dossier that would eventually be used to either recruit or neutralize him with maximum efficiency. Fett recognized the strategy because he employed similar methodologies when tracking targets who were too dangerous to approach directly. Study them, learn their patterns, identify their vulnerabilities, then strike when the opportunity for success exceeded the risk of failure. Vader was hunting him, just very, very slowly. Fett departed from Scarif with 500,000 credits added to his accounts and the certainty that his life had entered a new phase. He was no longer simply a bounty hunter, he was a Force-sensitive mercenary operating in the space between Imperial authority and Rebellion desperation, walking the line between light and dark without subscribing to either philosophy. It was dangerous territory, perhaps the most dangerous in the galaxy, but danger had always been his element. The following months established a pattern that would define this new phase of his existence. Contracts arrived through multiple channels: Imperial intelligence, Hutt cartels, corporate sector brokers, even occasional Rebellion sources who apparently believed his independence made him a potential ally. He accepted approximately half of what was offered, selecting jobs that met his financial requirements while avoiding anything that might lock him into exclusive arrangements or factional obligations. Each contract became an opportunity to refine his Force abilities. He learned to sense danger with increasing precision, to the point where ambushes became nearly impossible. He developed telekinetic techniques that allowed him to disable weapons systems and breach secured facilities without explosives. He practiced force concealment until he could move through Imperial checkpoints and rebellion safe houses without triggering any alarms. And perhaps most importantly, he learned to resist force-based attacks, building mental barriers that deflected mind tricks and reduced the effectiveness of telekinetic assaults. He was becoming what Vader had recognized on Tatooine, a Force user outside traditional hierarchies, bound to neither light nor dark, utilizing the Force as a tool rather than treating it as a religion. The galaxy noticed. Rumors began circulating through underworld channels about Boba Fett's seemingly supernatural abilities. Some said he had discovered ancient Sith artifacts that granted powers beyond normal limits. Others claimed he had undergone experimental Imperial augmentation. A few correctly guessed the truth, but were dismissed as propagating impossible conspiracies because everyone knew that Force sensitivity could not be developed later in life. It was something you were born with or not. Fett encouraged the speculation without confirming anything. Mystery was its own form of armor, and reputation built on uncertainty was harder to counter than reputation built on known capabilities. But the attention brought complications. 6 months after his demonstration on Scarif, he received a message through an encrypted channel that had no return address and no identifying markers. The message itself was simple: coordinates to a remote moon in wild space and a timestamp for a meeting. No explanation, no context, just the bare minimum information required to establish rendezvous. Every instinct screamed trap, but the Force whispered something else: opportunity. Fett debated for 3 days before deciding to investigate. He approached the moon with every sensor active, his Force awareness extended to maximum range, prepared to abort at the first indication of threat. The moon itself was unremarkable, airless, covered in impact craters, possessing no strategic value or resources worth exploiting. Perfect for a clandestine meeting or an ambush. He landed Slave 1 in a crater 2 kilometers from the specified coordinates, his armor sealed against vacuum, his weapons checked and ready. The walk across the lunar surface took 20 minutes, each step measured and cautious. And there, standing beside a small fighter craft that bore no identifying markings, was a figure in robes that marked them as possibly Jedi, possibly just someone who appreciated the aesthetic. Fett approached within speaking distance, his blaster drawn but not aimed. The figure turned, pulling back their hood to reveal features that Fett did not recognize. Human, female, perhaps 30 standard years old, with scars that suggested combat experience and eyes that evaluated him with the kind of professional assessment he associated with soldiers rather than mystics. "Boba Fett," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the vacuum through suit-to-suit communication. "My name is Ahsoka Tano. I need to discuss something important with you."